Hello and welcome to Glasgow Doors Open Days Digital Festival. This event will begin soon, but first we have a brief housekeeping message. So that you can get the most out of this session, we'd like to point out a few features of Zoom. By clicking on the buttons at the bottom of the Zoom window, you will be able to access the chat room, and if you are in a webinar, you will also be able to make use of the Q&A function. The Q&A function is so that you can ask specific questions of the speaker, which they will be able to answer time allowing at the end of the session. Use the chat room to contribute more generally to the discussion or to share links and resources. When using these features, please mind your P's and Q's. Both will be monitored and recorded. Most sessions will be recorded and uploaded to Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival YouTube channel and website. If you're in a meeting, please make sure you keep your microphone on mute unless otherwise directed by the host. If for some reason the session ends unexpectedly or you lose connection, please just click the link again and wait to be let back in. Similarly, if the host loses connection, please bear with us. We will do our best to manage any connection issues as and when they occur, and may contact you by email if necessary. Thank you so much for joining us today. We'd love to hear about your experience of our digital festival. Fill out our survey to be in with a chance of winning a prize. Our survey is available at www.glasgowdoorsopendayesfestival.org.uk/survey. We hope you enjoy this event. Hello everyone, my name's Stephen Sheriff. I am the coordinator for Glasgow Doors Open Days Festival, and welcome to this first day of the festival. We're of course all excited to be getting back into buildings at the weekend, but I'm very glad to see the return of our Digital Talks programme, which proved very popular last year. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Arlington Bath Club and Glasgow City Council and all of our sponsors who make this event possible. I'm now very glad to get things kicked off and to introduce Norry Wilson of Lost Glasgow.
Right, I hope you can all hear me. You should be able to see me as well. Now, if I get the technology working, I should be able to, hang on, host disabled participant screen sharing. Let's try that again. Here we go. Here we go. Right, fingers crossed. You can see what's going on, and I'll just hover here like an idiot in the corner of the picture while I'm speaking to you. So if you see me fiddling with my notes or anything, don't worry. Like Stephen, I had hoped to be back speaking to you face to face this year, so that I could see the whites of your eyes and measure how the top was going down in a face to face version. But we're all still in isolation. And in a year of lockdowns and isolation, Glasgow's public parks have proved a lifesaver for many as places to meet, socialise, exercise, and just escape the house, basically. From the city's ancient Glasgow Green, through Victorian pleasure gardens to the more modern play areas, Glaswegians have always revelled in their dear green places. Often today's weans play in the very same parks their grandparents or parents once enjoyed. From the Glasgow Fair to public protests, our parks have provided a stage and a backdrop to almost every event in the city's history. It's a tale of civic pride, swings and runabouts, skint knees, runny noses, first kisses, and huge 20-a-side football matches. And just as Shakespeare wrote of the 7 ages of man, there are usually 3 ages of the park. We first visit as children with our parents, and then on our own. And then we visit again as parents. And then again, if we're blessed, we're lucky if we visit as grandparents. Tonight, with so many Glasgow parks to choose from, we'll be visiting only 4, each unique with their own unique stories, 2 still thriving and surviving, and 2 vanished parks. So come with me, we're going up the park. We start where else but in Glasgow Green, the city's oldest park. In 1450, King James II granted the parkland to Bishop William Turnbull of Glasgow and the people of the city. The green then looked quite different from the green we know today. It was an uneven swamp area made up of several distinct greens, segregated by the Cumlacky and the Mollendiner Burns, the High Green and the Low Green, the Calton Green and the Gallowgate Green. In the centuries that followed, the parkland was used for grazing, washing, bleaching linen, drying fishing nets, and recreational activities like rowing and golf and swimming even. In 1732, Glasgow's first steamie, called the Wash House, opened in the banks of the Cumlacky Burn. From 25th December 1745 to the 3rd of January 1746, Bonnie Prince Charlie's army camped in the Fleshers Haw down at the Green. And famously in 1765, the Green was the site of the historic inspiration when inventor James Watt was strolling across the Green, and he stopped off in this wee stone building here, which was known as the Herd's House, for the chap who looked after the city's coos, used to while away his hours. And it was here that he hit on the idea of the separate steam condenser. So we can honestly say that Glasgow Green was pretty well the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. The city's militia also used to drill in the park. And when the Napoleonic Wars ended in 1815, there was an economic depression and many people were unemployed. In response, the Glasgow Town Council hired 324 jobless workers to remodel the Green, filling in the Low Green to bring it up to the height of the High Green. In 1817 and 1826, efforts were made again to improve the layout of the park. Culverts were built over the Cumlacky and Mollendiner Burns, and the park was levelled out and drained. Meanwhile, the Green became the locus of much political activity. The radical movement for parliamentary reform was growing, and in 1816, about 40,000 people attended a mass meeting in the Green to support demands for more representative government and for an end to the corn laws that were keeping food prices high. Then, in the spring of 1820, the Green became the meeting place for conspirators in what was to become known as the Radical War. Strikers carried out military drills in the Green, and before their brief rebellion was crushed, James Purley Wilson, the man that invented the purl stitch, a weaver from Straven, was convicted for treason for his part in allegedly being a leader of the insurrection. He ended up down at the Green as well, hanged and beheaded in the Green in front of a crowd of about 20,000 people. And the phrase "to die facing the monument" is still a common phrase in Glasgow when folk used to be hung outside the High Court, facing onto Glasgow Green and the monument on the Green. One of the other attractions in the Green, of course, was Scotch washing, where the Glasgow lassies would hook up their skirts and trade in the dirty washing in the great big wooden bowls. The Lakeland poets, William and Dorothy Wordsworth, they both witnessed it and described it as quite quaint. Needless to say, though, it was also, let's say, a popular attraction with Glasgow lads who had never seen an ankle, let alone a thigh. And if they went down to watch the girls in the Green, they ended up quite often getting a paddle full of water and getting chased away, as this guy is here on the right. Indeed, the Green still has its public drying greens, complete with clothes poles, and everyone in Glasgow has the right to make use of them. Although it's been a long time since I've seen a washing put out in the Green for drying. The Green was, of course, for years at the beating heart of the Glasgow Fair, a place of entertainment, penny geggies, dram shops, pickpockets and prostitutes of both sexes. I love this painting of the Glasgow Fair by Paisley-born artist John Knox, showing a high day in the Green during the Glasgow Fair. It was painted sometime in the 1820s, and then remarkably went missing for over 150 years. It turned up at an auction in London in 2013, where it was wrongly billed as the work of an Irish artist called William Turner de Lond, and was said to depict the fair in Aberdeen. Needless to say, a bit of research by Glasgow museums soon identified it as Glasgow Green, and they very fortunately bought it for the city. And if you go to Kelvin Grove, you can see it hanging there. It's an absolutely magnificent picture. The level of detail on it is just eye-popping. There's all life is there on Glasgow Green. The Green, of course, then, pretty well as now, was also a place of exercise. This is the adult gymnasium donated to the city by a Mr. D.G. Fleming in 1860. A successful Glasgow businessman, he'd moved down to Manchester where he'd made his fortune, but he still had fond memories of his native city. And he saw a similar gymnasium in an outdoor park in Manchester and thought, that's the very dab, I'll buy one and send it up to Glasgow, donate it to the people. And for years, generations of EastEnders and Carlton lads would test their, and lassies to be honest, would test their bravery by climbing on the ladders, walking along the beam up the top, swinging in the high ropes and doing tricks in the rings. The river, of course, was a place to row and swim. In fact, it was a few rowers on Glasgow Green who, quite bored one Saturday, decided to indulge themselves in the then new sport of football. Those guys would go on to form Glasgow Rangers. Now, the rowing still goes on down at the Green, but I'm not sure if I'd go in for a duke. There's a brave guy over on the right, his budgie smugglers, or his early Victorian version of the budgie smugglers, about to take the dip. The park, of course, was also a place of protest. Here's a wonderful picture of the May Day crowd in 1913. I wish I'd bought shares in a bunnock factory. Even the weans were in a bunnock. But looking into those faces of those men, and they are mostly men, our forebears, you have to wonder how many of them marched off to war the next year, never to return. Today, the park is still a place of plain protest. Here's a crowd shot of the demo in support of the Upper Clyde shipbuilders working in 1971. And who's that lurking up the back? It's the big Ian and his humble bum buddy, Tam Harvey, cousin of the more famous Alex Harvey. And of course, they weren't just in the crowd. Come the end of the talks and all the rest of it, the public speeches, Tam and Billy were right up on stage, giving it loudly, with another local lad at the microphone, Matt McGinn of the Carlton. And of course, Glasgow being Glasgow, we'll bump into Matt again later in this tale. But for me, Glasgow Green, despite all its changes and all its histories, is still a place of magic. Where else in Glasgow could you find one of these, complete with the People's Palace in the background? I think a few folk have seen goblins and fairies down at the Green, but I think usually drink's been involved. Right, we're now off to another park, the Botanic Gardens. No, not those Botanic Gardens. These Botanic Gardens, which were built so far west of Glasgow that they were nearly at the end of Sauchiehall Street in Sandyford. Here they are here. The original Glasgow Botanic Gardens were founded in an 8-acre site at the west end of Sauchiehall Street in 1817. This was through the initiative of a Thomas Hopkirk of Dalbeth, who had donated his own plant collection to form the nucleus of the new garden. And the gardens were run by the Royal Botanic Institute of Glasgow, as an agreement was reached with Glasgow University for the provision of teaching aids, plants, including the supply of plants for medical and botanical classes. Here's the original gates to that first Botanic Gardens. And it was very much a park for posh Glaswegians, having a wee promenade in the park. Here's a wonderful illustration from the Glasgow Looking Glass, which was regarded as the world's first comic magazine. And as usual, the illustrator is slightly taking the mickey out of those and such and those in Glasgow, with everyone done up to the nines, having a wee promenade with their ladies or their children, making the most of a rare sunny day in Glasgow. And here's how the great rockery and the greenhouse looked in that original park. Now, the trouble was, as Glasgow developed further west, land values rocketed. And the 8 acres of the original Botanic Gardens obviously became much more valuable for upmarket housing than just a fancy garden. So the gardens moved to their present site out at Kelvin Grove in 1842. And if you look round the wall of today's Botanic Gardens, you'll find this, the original foundation stone of those first vanished Botanic Gardens. At that time, entry into the gardens was mainly restricted to members of the Royal Botanical Institute and their friends, although later the public were admitted, but only on selected days, and for the princely sum of 1 penny. You had to pay to get in. Even then, it was still pretty posh. It was a place for the West End well-to-do, the new emerging middle classes, to show off their fashions, for gents to pursue young ladies and young ladies to look all hoity-toity in front of these young pursuants. And it was also a place where you would regularly see the nannies from the big houses out exercising their charges. These are absolutely spectacular perambulators. And you can bet that neither of the women pushing it are mums. No, they're the nannies of the house, taking the weans out for some air. The other, of course, fabulous attraction in the Botanics is the Kibble Palace, that great glazed spaceship, which now houses a forest of tree ferns. But the remarkable thing is, it didn't start its life in the West End. It was originally located down at Coolport in Loch Long and was moved to its present site in 1873, where it was originally used as a concert hall and meeting place, hosting celebrated speakers such as Gladstone and Disraeli. Its builder, John Kibble, has been described as an engineer, astronomer, and photographer, among many things. Certainly he was a Victorian entrepreneur and an eccentric. He dabbled in many things, winning awards for his photographs, using a camera, lenses, and glass plates so huge they had to be moved around in a horse and cart. Believe it or not, he was also the only man ever to have bicycled across Loch Long, using a special bicycle attached to floats. When his palace was moved to the Botanics, it was extended hugely, putting on that great big cross T entrance hall at the front. And when it opened in 1873, its interior was lit by 600 gas lamps, which could all be changed in colour using different coloured glasses for different effects. The remarkable thing is, though, we nearly lost the Kibble Palace. In January 1914, at the height of the fight for women's representation, the suffragettes nearly bombed the place. 2 small bombs packed into tin cans and metal pipes were found just beside the Kibble Palace, just before they went off. Newspaper reports at the time detail how a park caretaker who found one of the bombs very nearly lost his life as he snipped the burning fuse to prevent the explosion. So it was a close call for the kibble. But you still see some odd sights in the Botanics. I love this 1950s shot of two parkies getting their eye full of a couple of bathing beauties who were putting on a fashion show for Cochrane's department store in the city. And it's the usual in Glasgow, sunshine and snow. I bet these two lassies were absolutely freezing, but I love the guy on the right with the Nicky Tams or his trousers tucked into his socks to keep the heat in. And you also saw other strange sights. By the time the 60s came along, you get this, a wonderful newspaper story about Radio Clyde DJ Stuart Henry, who I used to listen to when he was in Radio Luxembourg years later. At that point, Radio Scotland was a pirate radio station. It wasn't an official radio station. It broadcast from a ship off the west coast of Scotland, but it had its offices right in the middle of the West End. So Stuart and a bunch of his hippie pals decided to stage what was then very exciting, a hippie happening in the Kibble Palace. Needless to say, this didn't go down quite well with the park keepers, who had absolutely no knowledge of what was about to descend on them. And they were very well and truly told to sling their hook. And I just love that Get Out the Garden mods headline. As a former newspaper sub-editor, that one gets top marks from me. Now, from the Botanics, we're off to a vanished park. Phoenix Park in the Old Cowcaddens. Situated at the foot of the Gascue Road, it's got its name from the fact that it was built on the site of the old Phoenix Iron Foundry. And needless to say, when the Phoenix Iron Foundry moved out, they were good enough to donate swings, and they also cast this magnificent bandstand, ornamental fountain, and wee drinking fountain over to the left. And in such a heavily industrialised and heavily populated part of central Glasgow, Phoenix Park was an absolute oasis for the kids of Cowcaddens. It was somewhere where they could get out, run about, breathe fresh air, no danger of getting hit by a tram or run over by a horse and cart. It was their own wee bit of heaven at the foot of the Gascue Road. Sadly, these wonderful fountains and the bandstand vanished in the 1950s when the park was remodelled. I love this one. It's obviously a summer's day because half the kids of Cowcaddens are in the fountain and there's water everywhere. But as I say, after the park was remodelled, it became a lot simpler. On the left there, you can see the two public bomb shelters which had been erected during the war years. But the other thing that was great about this park, that big chimney at the background, that belonged to a sweetie factory. So not only could you have a go in the swings or the roundabouts or play football, but the whole air was perfumed every day by the scent of sweeties. Different smells every day, depending on what the factory was making. One day it'd be cinnamon balls, the next day it'd be sour plumes. You can just imagine the sweet scent in that air, and all the weans pestering their mammy or their daddy for a halfpenny or a penny to go to the sweetie shop to get something. This park, sadly, vanished in the 1960s when the M8 smashed its way through the city. And it's almost hard to believe that this wee green oasis was there, because today all that remains down that way are these rather fanciful, flowery light standards. They're the only reminder of the park. Not a very good swap, I'm sure you'll agree. Now we're going to take a dive south of the river, so I hope you've got your passports with you and have had your injections. We're off to the Gorbals in the Baltic Street Adventure Playground. Centred around this hut, it was the brainwave of a Glasgow school teacher, poet and folk singer. Aye, it's Matt McGinn again. I told you we'd meet him again. Now, the great thing about the Baltic Street Adventure Playground, known as the Venny to the kids that used it, it was a place for the kids ruled the roost. A vegetable pleasure palace of rope ladders, tire swings, sugary half-built platforms, and scalp-infested climbing frames. The Gallus McGinn was once quoted as saying, "My job here is not to tell the kids to do this or to do that, but to be there for them if they want help. Another important, if unofficial job is to give them lights for their fags." Now, you can imagine that attitude didn't go down so well with the Glaswegians in George Square, who, following a snap inspection visit in 1966, decided to cut the playground's £1,000 a year corporation grant. More fool them, because this was a great place for the kids. They absolutely loved it. And when the council intervened, this is the side end of the park, which features in a wonderful book called Gorbals Children by Scots photographer Joseph Mackenzie, said to be the father of modern Scottish photography, who years later ended up, I knew him when he taught at Duncan of Jordanson College in Dundee. And I think I'm right in saying there's still a wonderful exhibition of his Dundee work on show at the McManus Galleries in Dundee, which is hugely overrun due to COVID. So they're keeping the doors open for a while yet, so I'll maybe yet get up to see it. But when the council decided to cut the funding for the park, the kids revolted. Some folk might say kids are always revolting, but this is what they did. They staged outdoor fundraising concerts. Somewhere down in that Stramash, there's a skiffle band performing for them. Here's a closer look at what's going on. And inspired by their parents, the kids protested. No doubt egged on by the mischievous McGinn, a red communist to the tips of his fingers. They set about staging fundraising concerts and making their own placards and banners. Their mums and dads, who had seen how much the weans enjoyed their wild playground, were equally angry, claiming that the park had helped cut down vandalism in the area. In August 1967, some 500 Gorbals weans marched in the city chambers to present a petition to the Lord Provost, demanding that the playground remain. Faced with such a mini mob, the corporation had only one option. They backed down. Not only did they reverse their funding cut, but they increased the money available to the Venny. Final score, weans 1, councillors 0. Now, I'm looking at my time and realising that I've probably actually raced through this a bit, which is the trouble when you don't have a live audience. But despite the fact that 2 of these parks are long lost, I'll leave you with this image, which most of you won't know. It's the former Civic Press building in Civic Street, and we're back up in Cookadden's Gascube Roadway. Usually, strangely enough, this is where we hold the planning meetings for Doors Open Day. It's now a communal workspace, a community venture, a community space. It's got an absolutely great cafe. And upstairs, it's got a wonderful, where the print hall used to be, it's got a wonderful wooded gallery space where they stage a variety of events. But here's the great thing. Civic House have just recently applied to take on some spare ground opposite them to create a new outdoor performance space and a community allotment. So watch this space where a phoenix may yet arise from the ashes of the old Phoenix Park. Now, as I say, I've rushed through this a bit, so at least that will hopefully give us time for a bit more chat and questions once I finish blathering. But just remember, the first rule of park life: what happens up the park stays up the park.
Oh, thank you so much for that, Norry. It's always fantastic to see all of those photographs that you somehow managed to get your hands on. I was about to call them costumes, but the clothes that people were wearing, they're always brilliant to see, and all those, the prams and mad contraptions that everyone's got. I think it was also really interesting to think about how important parks were in just daily lives, you know, for washing, for exercise, in a way that perhaps we've moved away for some of those uses now, and how those really used to bring people together. And I guess during lockdown, people have rediscovered a lot of these green spaces. I know that I personally found new nooks of parks that I thought I knew very well.
Yeah, I mean, over my side of town, Queen's Park is right on my doorstep, and it's been an absolute lifesaver the past year and a half. And the number of events that have been going on in the park, a lot of them just staged by, you know, some of them staged by the Govan Hill community, some of them staged by other local groups. But almost every weekend there seems to be something going on. And there's also, you know, the great hilarity of you'll be walking through the park first thing in the morning, and here's like, you know, 40 women doing an outdoor Zumba class, or folk getting put through an army boot camp class and all the rest of it, and folk having outdoor choirs and musicians and all the rest of it. It's been wonderful.
Yeah, I was really struck by that photograph of the young people protesting. It's good to hear of a successful protest like that.
Well, it's also that period when most of those kids would have seen their fathers and their big brothers and their uncles out in big protests. So the first thing that happens when something goes again, and they think, right, let's stage our own protest. It was almost like a hand-me-down protest.
We've got a question from David here. What does Norry think has created Glasgow's reputation as the deer green place, and what has influenced the development of so many parks in the city compared to others?
It's one of these sort of strange. I mean, as much as we revel in calling ourselves the deer green place, I think if we're actually honest with ourselves, Glasgow parks, despite the fact that we've been out enjoying them, have slipped in the last sort of 5 to 10 years. I mean, I'm particularly thinking of the fact that the Winter Garden of the People's Palace is currently closed. There's a chunk of the Winter Garden in Queen's Park, which has currently been dismantled, and all the rest of it. Because parks need to take money. Parks don't run themselves. They need an army of parkies, an army of gardeners, and all the rest of it. And over recent years, as budget cuts have come in, you see the result of budget cuts, with bits of parks becoming no-goes and all the rest of it. But then at the same time, you look out to the East End, and there's the plan to restore or at least bring back into use the Winter Garden at Tollcross Park. And it falls to local communities to almost to a certain extent to fight for their own local parks. And it's also the fact, one of the main reasons we've got so many parks is that for the vast majority of folk living in tenements, we're living cheek by jowl. It was quite often your families of 5, 6, 8, 10 living in a tenement, living in the one flat, and pretty well the only place you could get any privacy was to go to the park. Get away from your brothers and sisters, or if you were dad, to get away from the wife and the weans. Where did you go? You went to the park because room to breathe, room to think, room for a game of football or a game of chase with the kids.
In the talk, you also mentioned the radical wars and I believe it was the last public hanging that happened on Glasgow Green.
Not the last public hanging. The hangings went on for quite some time. It was the last ever beheading.
Correct.
And I think I'm right in saying poor James Wilson, he was buried in an unmarked grave up at Glasgow Cathedral. But needless to say, his family weren't allowed to attend the funeral, but then snuck up later that night with the aid of a couple of groundskeepers who kept edgy, and the family dug up the body and took him home to Straven in 2 bits.
There is actually a talk on Sunday at 2 p.m. by the 1820 Society about the Radical Wars. So if anyone is interested in that, they can tune in.
It's an absolutely fascinating story, the Radical Wars. It really is. It really is. And it's pretty well that same period as Peterloo down in Manchester. And it's one of, I mean, I was probably well into my late 20s or early 30s before I'd ever even heard about it, because it certainly wasn't something that I was taught about at school. But it's absolutely fascinating. There's a wonderful book now, I think it is just called 1820 by Maggie, her name will come back to me. It was published, I think, just last year to coincide with the 200th anniversary of the Radical War, and it gives you almost like an hour by hour, day by day account of what happened, and it's just fascinating. It's just fascinating.
We've got a question from Lorna here. She would like to know if you have any recommendations of sources for photos.
The best source I always find is the Mitchell Library. The Virtual Mitchell site is absolutely brilliant because you can go in and search by so many different tabs. You can go in and search by street name, by district, by location, by industry, all those sort of things. The other site that's absolutely great is a site called the Glasgow Story, which was put together probably about 15 years ago, written by some of the top historians in the city, drawing on the Glasgow City Archive, picture archive.
And another question from Emily's. Is there a park that you didn't think you had time to talk about that you'd like to mention now?
I would probably have done some stuff about Queen's Park, simply again because it's got a good story behind it, and I'm trying to remember the chap's name, the chap that used to live in the wonderful mansion house in Queen's Park that's long since been split into flats, Camphill House, because he's one of these great benevolent figures of Glasgow at a time when many bakers in Glasgow were putting such things as sawdust and arsenic into their bread so that they could sell cheaper bread, even though it would probably kill you. He established what was called the Crossmaloof Bakery, right at Crossmaloof, just sort of diagonally opposite where the Marlborough, the Shed nightclub is today. And he came up with this thing called the Crossmaloof loaf, which was guaranteed to be free of dangerous additives. And he sold it at a low price. And he ended up selling virtually mobile bakers. He had horses and carts selling Crossmaloof bread all over Glasgow. And with the fortune that he made, he basically donated the land around his house to become the start of Queen's Park.
From Annie, I know there's a current Baltic Street Adventure Playground, but I had no idea about the original one. Is the current park in the same site?
I'm not sure. I'd need to, it's one of these strange ones. I'd need to go back and have a look at some of the old maps, because the original Baltic Street Adventure Playground was very much on a gap site. So it's trying to find if literally a temporary play park will be marked on an OS map or a proper Glasgow map. I suspect there'll be that sort of blank in the history trail, because what you'll have marked is tenements, and then nothing. and then the next map will show you what was built in the site. So as I say, I think there may well be a gap in the history there. Although I'm sure a few old Gorbalites could take you to the exact spot and say, this is where we used to play. So it may well be that it is on the same site.
There's actually loads of empty ground just next to Baltic Street Playground. I'd love to think that some of that could be developed into green space around there. Cheryl's asking, what is a penny geggy?
A penny geggy, if you've ever heard somebody say shut your geggy, as in shut your mouth, geggy's an old word for mouth, but it was also an old word for the small curtain opening of a theatre. So a penny geggy was a small theatre where you paid a penny to sit and watch the show. And if you thought the show was rubbish, you'd shout at them, shut your geggy.
I don't think that would fly these days.
And particularly at the Glasgow Fair, all around Jail Square, which is now Jocelyn Square, and all throughout Glasgow Green, there'd be penny geggies all competing with each other, all putting on the equivalent of like pantomimes and bits of music hall, singers and musicians, all just trying to pull in the biggest crowd and the most money.
From Aileen, what happened to the Venny?
Well, it may well have eventually mutated into today's Baltic Street playground. It's certainly the original hut that it was in is long gone. Matt McGinn, in one of his books, speaks about the fact that they used to, at the end of each day, when there's leftover newspapers at the shops, they used to send the weans round to collect the unsold newspapers, and literally once a month they would repaper the inside of the hut with newspapers, and then over the course of the next month the kids would just absolutely cover the interior of the hut with the rudest graffiti you can imagine, using borrowed cans of paint and spray cans and all the rest of it. And then in the next month again, they'd have to repaper the whole thing again to give them another blank canvas.
From Annie, I've always been intrigued by an area of the Green called McFunn's Park, but I've never been able to find out why. Do you know?
Now, McFunn's Park is almost a bit like the sort of adult gymnasium, the picture that I showed. And back in the late 1800s, it was a sort of spectacular children's play park with swings and roundabouts and all the rest of it. I suspect the McFun in the title of it is the same Mr. McFun who donated a whole series of public drinking fountains to Glasgow. And I think there might be a McFun fountain down in the Green still. There's certainly a couple still dotted about the city, but where exactly, I can't off the top of my head remember. But it was another one of these sort of local self-made Glasgow guys who made his fortune and then donated nice things back to his home city.
Are there any more questions? So, if anyone wants to give people a minute to write any last questions in. Norry was talking about Civic House earlier on. Thursday at 6 p.m, we do have a webinar by Civic House, and they'll be talking about the retrofit of their building into a passive warehouse, which they've been doing in collaboration with Collective Architecture. So that is Thursday at 6 if you're interested. Okay, well, if there are no other questions, then I'd just like to thank Norry very much. You're always a Glasgow's Open Days firm favourite, so thank you for coming back.
My pleasure.
And lots of appreciation in the chat for you as well. I'd just like to say to attendees as well, there's a £100 gift voucher for a Glasgow local business of your choice up for grabs if you would like to fill in the festival survey. And I've just put the link into the chat for you if you want to have a go at that. And I would encourage you to have a look at the 2021 programme, which is available on the website. There's lots more digital talks happening throughout the week. There's lots of tickets still left for some of the digital talks. Quite a lot of the bookable buildings at the weekend are full. However, there's also a programme of buildings that are open that you do not need tickets for. So please do come and see us at the weekend. And again, thank you so much to Norry Wilson.
Fingers crossed I'll be seeing you all in person next year.
Yes, for sure.
Good stuff. Thanks, folks.
Thank you, Norry.
Have a great Doors Open day.